Hello, welcome to CrossCurrents, produced by the City of Fort Collins in cooperation with the Larimer County League of Women Voters. I'm Barbara Rutstein, the moderator for today's program. Our topic is water for fracking, at what cost? For some of us, fracking or hydraulic fracturing is a fairly new term. However, this kind of drilling of gas and oil has been going on in Colorado since 1947. It is only in the last few years that it has become an issue in northern Colorado because of improved technology and the vast discovery of gas and oil in the Niobrara Shale in the Wattenberg Field in Weld County, northeast of Denver. The fracking technique introduces a huge demand for an already scarce resource, and it creates issues dealing with water availability, water quality, groundwater protection, as well as air quality and land use. Today, we are dealing mainly with water issues, although we recognize the importance of the other concerns. We invited several oil and gas corporate representatives to our panel, but they declined to participate. On our panel, we are happy to have three well-informed participants. On my right is Mike Shiropoulos, Chief Counsel of the Lands Program of Western Resource Advocates. Next to him is Tisha Connolly Schuler, President and Chief Executive Officer of the Colorado Oil and Gas Association. And next to her is Philip Doe, former Environmental Office of the Bureau of Reclamation. Welcome to you and to our studio and viewing audiences. Let's begin with a description of the fracking process. And I ask Tisha to start with that, and then we can have others jump in if they would like to add anything or make any other comments. The first thing we have over here on our screen is the drilling distance. Let's talk about that first.
So thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. The first thing when we talk about hydraulic fracturing is we talk about drilling, because hydraulic fracturing is a component of the drilling process. And so it's important to have a picture in your mind of what drilling looks like. So what you see here to the right is what we call a horizontal well. So you can see it goes straight down, and then it basically makes a 90-degree turn to follow that oil and gas resource. And what this image is demonstrating is that the Niobrara Shale that we're talking about on today's program is about 7,000 feet below ground surface. So if you have been to Denver and are familiar with the Wells Fargo Cash Register building, the second tallest building in Denver, that's the equivalent of 10 of those below ground surface. And then because we're talking about water today, what you see up at the top is the shallow aquifer. So most drinking water in Colorado is located in the top a few hundred feet, in some places as many as 1,000 feet below ground surface. But that shallow aquifer is separated from the resource by, in this case, 4,000 feet of Pierre Shale, which we'll talk about later. So hydraulic fracturing is actually the process once you've drilled a well and you've set cementing and casing, which we'll talk about later. And the purpose of cementing and casing is to protect those shallow water resources. Once you've done that, one aspect of the drilling process is hydraulic fracturing. So essentially, what a company does is they use high pressure fluid.
Let's go to the next slide and show the next one. This one, yes. Describe that one.
So before we talk about hydraulic fracturing, we'll talk a little bit about the Pierre Shale in the Front Range of Colorado. What you see here is a geology cross-section if you were looking from the mountains out to the plains. And what you can see is that under almost all of eastern Colorado, we have 4,000 feet of impermeable Pierre Shale. So this isolates the Niobrara resource from those shallow aquifers. It gives you an idea of what the geology looks like in Colorado as well.
Now let's go to the casing. There we are.
So the purpose of cementing and casing is twofold. First, you have surface casing, and it is set below the underground source of drinking water in the area. The purpose of a surface casing, it's a layer of cement and steel whose purpose is to isolate the shallow aquifer, and it's set before you do any further drilling. And then you actually have another layer of cement and steel that's put in after that, and that's the production casing. And that actually will follow flow all the way down through the 90-degree turn that we saw earlier for horizontal drilling. The purpose of the production casing is to isolate the oil and gas resource and ensure that it's going back up through steel and cement to make sure that it's contained within the operations.
Okay, let's go to the next one that shows the fracturing. That one, yes.
So hydraulic fracturing is using high pressure fluid, and it is used to create micro fractures in the oil and gas formation. So this isn't my slide, but what you can get a sense for here is that down in the formation, those fractures are done in stages, and they're isolated within that oil and gas resource. So a good hydraulic fracture has micro fractures that go approximately a couple hundred feet in distance at the most. And in the case, if you have an overlying formation, there's a lot of pressure limiting how those fractures continue. Once that water is used to create those microfractures, proppant, or tiny sand grains, are left in the spaces. And then the fluid is removed to surface, and those little sand grains, that proppant holds open those microfractures to allow the oil or gas resource to flow to surface. In most of Colorado, without hydraulic fracturing, the material is so dense that you would have no flow of oil and gas resource. So it's the hydraulic fracturing that allows the oil and gas resource to flow.
Okay, would you like to add anything to that?
That's the slide I provided. I just want to point out that theoretically, the well bores have 100% integrity all the time, and the groundwater is not threatened. But everybody in the realm of human existence, we're mortal. The engineers, the petroleum geologists, everybody does their best, but accidents can and will happen, and sometimes you have unexpected conditions when you're drilling to 7,000 feet. The rock formations are uncertain, and something can go wrong. You've got human error and mechanical error. So you do have incidents, and I think everybody's goal is to minimize those incidences, avoid them in the first place. And if they do happen, we want to jump on them as soon as we can and do everything we can to mitigate and prevent any problems that stem from a problem.
Okay, Philip, do you have anything to add?
Well, I'd only add that this cartoon doesn't really give you a proper feeling of how big an industrial activity this is. This is heavy industry.
Okay,
And
well,
this
you can
doesn't-
talk
This
to
doesn't
that.
give you that indication.
On the
We're
top there, though, we have those trucks, and I think it says the truck is bringing in how much water? Can you read that and see? I think it's 200 tankers for one frac.
Well, that depends on how much water you're going to use for the frac.
Right.
If it's 5 million gallons, you're not going to do it with 200 trucks.
So how many would you need
Well,
for
you
5
have a
million?
weight limit in this state of 80,000 pounds.
Okay.
So you could easily, if you had, say, 8 wells on one pad for a horizontal fracking, you could easily come up with, I don't know, maybe 5,000 truckloads.
Okay, well, I just want to read that maybe so the people can see. These trucks on the top, and I thought that was a good slide to show. It says here, roughly 200 tanker trucks deliver water for the fracturing process, and then a pumper truck injects the mix of sand and water and chemicals into the well, and you can see that going down on the left side. And then on the right side, the natural gas flows out through the well, and then the recovered water is stored in open pits and then taken to a treatment plant. And we'll talk about that later, because I don't know if that happens in Colorado. And then the tanks you see beyond the truck on the right side show the storage tanks, and then the natural gas going out in pipes all the way out on the right side. So then you have some idea. We can discuss how many trucks are used, if there's another way of bringing water in, but we'll get to that.
Just to point out, that slide, it says Marcellus Shale, so that was probably a Pennsylvania drilling operation and frac job, and the quantities of water might be different here for the Niobrara, where we're talking about in Larimer County.
Okay. Now tell us what has changed? What has changed in the technology?
So in the past couple years, the major 2 advancements that have allowed oil and gas to be produced with a much smaller environmental footprint overall per BTU produced is two things: multi-stage hydraulic fracturing and horizontal well drilling. So historically, we would have vertical wells. So because your oil and gas resource is a horizontal resource, that vertical well would access that in one 4-inch location. And so for each well, you had to have a road and a pipeline and all the activity going on there. Now with horizontal drilling, and we actually have a slide for this if it's helpful, you can locate the same number of wells on one pad that would have historically required 32 well pads, because you can follow that resource horizontally. So it requires a much smaller surface footprint. Now the one well pad is going to be significantly bigger than a small pad would be because you're locating 6 wells on it, but you really have the opportunity to reduce your environmental footprint. Also, multi-stage hydraulic fracturing essentially means that you're isolating an area to perform a hydraulic fracturing operation, then they isolate the next area. So those laterals can be up to 1 mile long.
Okay?
So 2 points. First, I would say that modern hydraulic fracturing is a new technology to recover the oil and gas from these shale formations, which couldn't be produced with yesterday's technology, 10 years or more. So fracking's been around since the 1940s, possibly, but today's modern fracking is to access these shale formations. And so what's changed, we're getting gas out of rock. And I was on a panel at the Colorado Law School with a geologist engineer, and he said when you drive from Boulder to Golden, those outcrops you're looking at, essentially solid rock, are the same formations underground that are being tapped by some of the wells. So it's taking this technology because we're trying to cavitize what's essentially a solid rock. In the old days, in regard to the surface footprint, industry is working really hard to minimize the surface footprint. Everybody's on board for that. But in the old days, you'd have about 4 well locations per section, roughly 160 acre spacing, maybe 80 acre spacing. Some of the shales, and I'm not familiar with the Niobrara, I think it's still being determined, but some of the formations on the west slope, I think is it the Mesa Verde or the Williams Fork, they're drawing at 10 acre surface spacing. So even if you get 16 or 32 wells on a pad, you're kind of back where you started in terms of 2 or 4 well pad locations per section, and bigger ones, as Tisha noted. So, and everybody wants to work together to minimize the surface footprint and the habitat fragmentation, and technology is a great tool to get us there.
Okay. Phil, any comments?
Well, yes, I think it's unfortunate we haven't looked at how vast this shale formation is. It literally covers the whole state. And so if you're looking at one section like this, you should really start thinking in terms of the 109,000 square miles that make up this state. You could literally, if you put up 8 wells on each of those sections, you would be out of water in no time. I think that that's the problem we have. The Niobrara Shale is over 8,000 square miles. It's 4 times as large as the Bakken in North Dakota, which makes the press every day. But none of us have sat down and looked at how much water it's going to require to do this.
Okay.
And we're way past time we should have done that.
Okay, well, that leads into my question. I read that there are approximately 45,000 active oil and gas wells in Colorado, and do most of these use fracking, the fracking technique?
So there are over 45,000 wells in the state. Over 90% have been hydraulically fractured. To be clear, drilling rigs are temporary, and hydraulic fracturing is also a temporary process. So many wells will produce for 10, 20, 30 years, and the hydraulic fracturing is a few day element of that process. After some number of time, 10 years, 15 years, companies do go back and re-frack wells. So there is a process of returning to existing wells, but there aren't 45,000 wells being fracked in the state in a given year. That said, Phil was correct that the Niobrara does underlies not just Colorado, but it underlies many states. But what we know is that it's not viable for production in many areas, and that the extent of it being viable for production has only been proven in Weld County, and it still remains to be seen among the Front Range. And I think we all have an interest in having an understanding of what that development might look like so that we can plan appropriately for the resources of the state.
Okay, now one of the things I read in the paper is that there was a company that predicted 2,700 wells in the Wattenberg field alone. How would they get water for that?
So right now, Weld County has 1/3 of all wells in the state. So Weld County currently has over 15,000 wells, just to give an idea of the context. Colorado has been drilling about 3,000 wells a year on average, and that capacity looks like it will hold pretty steady. We're only about 60% recovered from the 2008, where we were in the high of drilling in 2008. So with regards to where's water going to come from, it would require a little bit of explanation of the quantity of water. Do you want me to go into that?
Sure.
Okay. So the quantity of water required per well varies based on a few things. The type of well, so a vertical well requires less water than a horizontal well for obvious reasons of the length, and the number of fracture stages matters as well. So we've collected data, as has the state, on what's being used. And so for vertical wells, the average is about 200,000 gallons used for both drilling and hydraulic fracturing. With regards to horizontal wells, the CSU just put out a study that in Colorado it's averaging about 2.5 million gallons. But for the state, to give you a sense, an extent of the range, that can be up to 5 million gallons is a number that has been seen in, say, the East. So putting that in some context, the state did an analysis of how much water is this and how much is it relevant to the state. And acknowledging that all water is important in the state, even at a maximum build-out scenario, the oil and gas industry still uses 10/100ths of 1% of all the water used in the state. So that's not 10%, it's 1/10 of 1%, or 10/100ths of a percent. And that's at their forecast for 2015. So this is in line with the amount of water used in snowmaking or the amount of water used in golf courses. So it's an important water use, but in the context of the state, it is one of many users of water.
Okay, go ahead.
Well, I would just add that no matter, and we're going to argue over how much water will eventually be used, but there's a grand distinction between snowmaking and golf course use and what they do in fracking. The water that's used in fracking is used to extinction. It is taken out of the hydrologic cycle. We never see it again. That is a vast difference. It's different than any other water use we have in this state. And people have to realize that. When they say 5 million gallons for a frac, they're talking about 5 million gallons that will never see light again, if they're lucky. And that's enough water for probably 150, the annual water needs of 150 people. So we're talking about vast quantities of water that will be needed for this enterprise. And there are other methods of doing fracking besides water, and those should be considered in this state. But we're having a hard time getting the attention of the governor and some of the legislatures about what this might mean. I mean, literally, this whole state is underlain by shale, and we don't know how much water it will take. But before we buy into this bargain, which may be a Faustian bargain, we should know how much water it's going to take. That would be our first concern, because as W.H. Auden said, thousands of people have lived without love, but nobody has lived without water.
Okay, Mike, any comments?
The water quantity issue has just started to get attention, and it really started to get more attention. The stronger review, multi-state objective review of Colorado's hydraulic fracturing regulatory framework had 5 recommendations, and recommendation 5 was that we live in an arid state. It's an arid region. This does use significant quantities of water, and the report didn't make any conclusions but said we really need to pay attention to the issue. One of Western Resource Advocates' water resource specialist has looked at the issue recently, and one of the contentions she's made is that rather than comparing fracking to all the water use in the state, we should compare it against municipal and industrial uses. In my understanding, that's about 7.4%. Ag's about 85, Phil.
Yeah.
I'm not sure what the remaining 7 to 8% is, but it's an important issue, and some of the things that come up are, do we want to be diverting water from the West Slope to frack oil and gas wells here in the Front Range? If we have a drought year, should farms be going dry because we've got a lot of drilling and fracking going on? I'm just throwing out some of the issues, not conclusions, but policy questions we've got. And if we've got a warming climate, which could lead to less overall water to grow around in the state, especially with a growing population, Every drop is going to matter more and more. We've already seen it where we've had calls in some of the farms towards the Platte, downstream from Boulder where I live. Some of the farms have gone dry because Boulder's making a call on its water, so people can drink and do what they're doing.
Okay, well, that leads into my question, which was, again, I read somewhere that state officials have said that we are short 600,000 to 1 million acre feet needed just to sustain the population that we have now. So then if we bring in another use, what gets dried up? And can agricultural water be diverted to industrial use? Is that an issue? The farmer just sells his water? What are the possibilities?
It's got to come from somewhere. One of the old sayings in Colorado water law is water flows uphill to money. And if you're growing alfalfa, that's not the most economic, profitable choice. And a profitable oil and gas well, if the price of natural gas goes up, certainly if they've got liquid petroleum and oil now, it's going to be much more economic and profitable to use the water for oil. I think one thing that we can agree on with regard to the water quality, we need good information and publicly accessible data, so we're not making estimates. And I think the fracking disclosure rule got us started a little bit on this path, but the companies should be reporting how many gallons or acre feet they're using, where it's coming from, what they're paying for it, what transfer mechanism is used, and what happens to the water afterwards. So we've got good data out there. We don't have the answers yet at this point of time. A lot of it is conjectural, how much water is ultimately going to be demanded, but we need to plan for it.
And where is the water coming from now?
So there's a lot of things that I think everyone at this table can agree on. So I will answer your question.
Sure.
But one of the things we can agree on is that more data and more discussion is required of all of us when it comes to water in Colorado. So these conversations aren't unique to oil and gas, but to all developers of any kind and of any industry. That said, oil and gas is like any other water user. Oil and gas industry has to get a water right legally, so they can lease it, they can purchase it, they may own their own water rights. And in that context, I think these conversations are very important, as with any other user. And they're important in the context of communities, because water right is a value that somebody has, and having a conversation about how they're going to use their water right should be the same for oil and gas as any other water user. That said, we're in full agreement that we need more data, we need more conversations, and industry is sitting down in nearly every community to have those kind of conversations.
Okay, well now, yes, go ahead.
Well, just a little background here. I mean, we use about 16 million acre feet of water a year in this state.
60 or 16?
16.
16.
But we use it over and over again. It's not just used once. This enterprise, you use it once and it's gone. The other fact that we have to consider is that on the Front Range, our rivers are over-appropriated now. We don't have any extra water, and the only way we'll get any is to import more from the West Slope, which the organization I'm a member of, Be the Change, we absolutely oppose. We're destroying the Colorado River drainage, and we just have to live with what we have. It's the way most of us live our lives, and we should do that here. So I think there's a really complex interchange here that we haven't examined. If we're out of water, we're going to have to take it from agriculture. Now, I would be the first to admit that agriculture can be better run than it is in many cases. But is this the decision we want to make as a state, that will rob agriculture of its water so that we can get more oil and gas? Water is the rarest thing in the world. It's much more rare than oil and gas. Less than 1% of the water in the world is available for drinking and raising of crops. Keep that in mind. This should be our first consideration. Are we willing to give up that 1% to oil and gas so that huge profits can be made in this enterprise, when there are other alternatives to water?
I don't disagree with the importance of water and the importance of the conversation about water, but I do think there's a different paradigm within which to contemplate water use and energy use. And the fact is that as a culture, energy use in all its form is a cornerstone of our lifestyle. And natural gas and oil through unconventional production is one of the most efficient ways in terms of BTU produced per gallon. And so if we're going to be a society that consumes energy both to keep these lights on and to keep the heat on here and to drive our cars, then we do need to contemplate from where will I get my energy and how is water used to get it to me. And every form of energy production uses water, and so it's worth contemplating, is it efficient? And one of the things that we've done on our website, if you're interested in delving into the details, at koga.org, we have a fact sheet that looks at how much water do you use in your house and how much water is used to provide the energy that you use in your house. And it's a small fraction, but we do need energy, and we do need to thoughtfully contemplate efficient water use to get energy to us.
Okay, another question. Could a oil or gas company actually buy a ditch company? Is that a possibility?
Well, right now,
I don't know, go ahead.
Go ahead.
right now, mostly they're buying on the spot market. They're buying from cities. They're driving up to turnouts and just filling up their water trucks and taking it to the drilling sites. That to me is a problem. There's no question the city has the right to sell the water, but there's a question in my mind whether these people have a right to change that use under that water right agreement. I know in the southern part of the state, Shell Oil Company has bought, I think, leased about 130,000 acres of land in Huerfano County, and they're also buying up water rights. Now, in that case, under Colorado water law, they will have to go into water court to get a change of use, probably change of diversion. But that's not happening up here, and I think it is a major problem that should be examined. I mean, the truth of the matter is that the water of this state belongs to the people under the Constitution, black letter law, and we have not had an opportunity to engage in this subject at all. It's just gone on sub rosa, and it's time it got to the forefront, and we had a long, extended conversation about how we want to use our water and whether we really agree that it should be used to extinction by the oil and gas industry.
Okay. What about the technology of using compressed air instead of water?
So there are several different technologies under development and use in certain areas that use, I haven't heard compressed air, but propane, for example, as a way to not use water. There's also different hydraulic fracturing additives that reduce the use of water. So a couple things about all these technologies. One, every basin is different, and every technology has a trade-off. So if you use one additive that reduces water, you might be increasing the use of a chemical, which communities are very sensitive to. If you're using propane, it comes with its own set of risks and considerations. And so, although I believe we have seen some propane use in northwest Colorado, these are things that communities have concerns with as well. So these are important conversations within communities, the trade-offs of using one kind of additive, using one kind of base fluid, and they all are opportunities for continued conversation and continued advancement.
Okay, do we have a question out there? And ask your question. You may direct it to one person, and then I will let the others answer.
My name's Cindy Nettles Anderson. I'm actually running for Colorado State Senate right now for Fort Collins. But my specialty of study is actually electricity production and water consumption during it. And one small thing just to point out is to produce 1 million BTUs of ethanol, it takes 30 to 70,000 gallons of water. To produce that same amount out of gasoline or fossil fuels, it takes 6 to 7 gallons of water. But in that same area, I've been studying a lot about the recycling of produced water and would like to know, we've got all these new technologies that are coming out about recycling it and reusing it multiple times for fracking. How far are we from being able to use those technologies?
There's a lot of recycling going on of water in Colorado right now. And in fact, all the estimates of water use that I provide you assume no recycling. But in fact, we don't have good numbers. This is where we all agree we need more data. So this is information we gather from our operators. But essentially, we think that about a third of all water right now used in hydraulic fracturing is recycled and reused. Now, you might say, well, that should be 100%, but there are very real considerations because you need technology and you actually need a footprint to do recycling. So you have to be in an area that wants to have that kind of operation. So all these things have considerations. If you want recycling of water, you have to build the infrastructure for it, and you have to do that. If you want pipelines, you have to allow pipelines. Alternatives are trucking. So these are all conversations that happen in communities about what do you want locally, what do you want happening outside of your jurisdiction, and companies are increasing their recycling, and there are a ton of university and industry partnerships that are developing specific improved technologies. One thing I think we can all get excited about is the ability to use increasingly high TDS water, so salty, not drinkable water for hydraulic fracturing. So the ability to use non-potable water, so you can recycle more, you can use water that's not available for other uses. These are ways technology is advancing in a way that I think we all can be excited about.
Mike?
But I think the question also goes to the issue of produced water. And, I've worked quite a bit in the Powder River Basin, northeast Wyoming, and southeast Montana, where, as Phil's already noted, ranching's a marginal business, and it's tough to eke out a living. You're dealing with climate, weather, beef prices, everything else, and they're trying to do surface disposal of the produced water. They pump out the coal bed methane formation to dewater it. That saline water gets put into the gullies, runs off into the stream, and your bottom land, which is your most productive pasture land, you're trying to eke out a living, and gets that much harder. So, and I think the larger issue, and I'll address a little bit later, but as long as we're dependent on fossil fuels as a society, we're going to be choosing amongst a range of bad choices that we just as soon avoid, but we are highly energy consumptive, and as it is now, we're addicted and we need it to keep the lights on.
Phil?
Well, I think we need a more rational process than we have. I think we need to look at these alternatives, such as gelled propane as an alternative to water. One thing I must say about the return flows is that the returns, the water that comes back to the surface with the oil and gas and the initial phase of fracking, can vary from anywhere from 9% to 40 or 50%. My talking to senior geologists in the field, particularly in Niobrara, now that's entirely different than what's going on in the Powder River, where they're trying to move the water out so the gas will move with it. This water goes down there and stays down there. And they like it when there's not much water coming back because it means it's drier, and they're probably going to get more production. That's my understanding. But realize that most of that water, if it's good producing well, probably stays down there. And there is some reprocessing of that water, but they reprocess it to use it again at the well site. So it really is used to extinction. Right now, my understanding, there are 200 Class II wells out here in the state for the disposal of this water. And there are another 600 where they're disposing water. That seems to me to be raise an issue about, is this what we really want to do, be putting all this water down in these so-called self-contained areas of the earth? I don't know. I think we should have a conversation about that too, because there are other alternatives. And I hope that when you get done with this, that you'll see that there are alternatives other than just using our water supply.
Hi, my name is Tom Moore. I just need a little context when we talk about all this management stuff for water. It just seems like the price of gas doesn't support the amount of drilling that is predicted. And I just wondered if the panelists could, comment on that, because it seems like planning for this needs to have some horizon in terms of what the actual level of drilling activity is going to be.
Sure, that's a very astute question, and there's lots of confusion about this, so I relish the opportunity to address it. Colorado historically has been an 85% natural gas producing state, and over the past decades, oil and natural gas prices have more or less tracked together. But somewhere around 2008, they started tracking differently. So because they're on commodity markets and those commodity markets are now working independently, oil is selling at a higher price, and it's likely to continue to go up for some foreseeable future. Whereas natural gas, we're awash in it in this country, and in fact likely worldwide. And so natural gas prices are depressed and forecast to be depressed for the future. So while in 2008 we saw a lot of oil and gas activity on the western slope, that's gas, that's natural gas dominated. This interest that you see along the Front Range is dominated by natural gas liquids, which include oil. So natural gas liquids are the things that are used for all the petroleum products that we use, our tennis shoes, our tires, our everything that we have any kind of plastic comes from natural gas liquids. So these are sold on independent markets and their value is much higher. The Niobrara is thought to be about 60% liquids. So there is natural gas that's produced in association, it's significant, but the interest in the Front Range is natural gas liquids and oil. Thanks for the question.
Anyone else?
Yeah, it's a great question, and gas prices, as you noted, are historically low. Is it something like $2 a thousand cubic feet, and it's been as high as 8 to 10? I've heard utility executives, real informed folks, officials from Xcel saying they're real nervous about gas because it's cheap today, but if they make a long-term bet on gas, like we have in this state when we pass Clean Air, Clean Jobs, prices are low now, but if they go up 50, 100, 200, 400%, you'll see that in your utility bills. Some of the larger issues you're also looking at, Governor Hickenlooper is trying to create additional demand for natural gas, compressed natural gas to run our transportation fleet, our light-duty vehicles. A lot of industry, a lot of companies are talking about liquid natural gas export facilities so we can export gas through the Gulf of Mexico or the Northwest Coast, pipe it from the Rockies, or they're producing. The whole idea there is that prices are going to go up and we all feel it. So when the gas industry says, we're here to help, I reach for my wallet to see if it's still there.
I have his wallet.
I'd just like to add that I read an article in The Economist last summer that said that on the Pacific Rim, the price of gas is about 3 times what it is here, and in Europe it's about twice. So there's no question that the oil industry is striving very diligently to export the gas. Whether you think that's a good idea from a national perspective, I leave up to you. But I think that's in the cards if they can get away with it, and it will definitely raise the price of gas. And I agree with Tisha entirely that the Niobrara play is for oil. These guys are just breaking even, from what I hear on the street, on gas. Maybe not even breaking even, but they can make a lot of money on oil, and that's what they're after. That's what the Niobrara is all about, is oil.
So
Okay.
can I just add one
Sure.
thing? I have a little more optimistic view of depressed natural gas prices for the consumer. This means that natural gas-fired generation is extraordinarily affordable, and I don't know if you've been following the news, but nationwide, utilities are converting coal to natural gas because it's actually more affordable, not just because of clean air drivers. So for the foreseeable future, while we don't have alternatives that can take up 30, 40, 50, 80% of our electricity production, we have the opportunity to have natural gas-fired generation very affordable, which is a significant contributor to clean air. And we're not talking about clean air, but I just wanted to have a little optimistic note to this.
I just say it's a gamble. If, like Phil says, if we go on the world market and prices rise significantly, that natural gas plant that you paid $500 million for today, based on today's prices, is going to be a whole lot more expensive to the end electricity users. You don't know, and it's a commodities market. Coal's probably been the most stable. Coal's the worst for the climate, but it's the cheapest if you take the environmental external factors out of it. And what we're trying to build is a world where renewable conservation, efficiency, and renewables in that order of priority are the cheapest and the best ways to go.
Well, much of my questions involve what happens when you take clean water and you pump it down into a formation and you've laced that clean water with possibly as many as 100 or 200 different chemicals, some of which are organics, some of which are corrosion inhibitors, some of which are certainly not things that I would want to come in contact with unless I was in a laboratory or an industrial environment. And you put it in the ground under pressure with the hopes that you'll get the result that you want, which is a controlled fracture in a certain formation. But what happens when things go wrong? And I have to tell you that often the things that go wrong, the way I understand them, are pretty catastrophic. I've seen pictures in a movie called Gasland of people having really severe problems with health and safety. And the kind of solutions that I saw in that particular documentary was, well, let's just pay these people off and hush that problem. So I kind of get the feeling that we're talking about something from a different perspective here tonight, and that's how much water do we need if everything went properly and everything was controlled and predictable. But as we know, when we drill in the Gulf of Mexico, it doesn't turn out that way.
Okay, we're
And
going to
it
get
doesn't
to
turn out
that.
that way here in Colorado either. So I'm not done yet. I have a two-part question. How do you presently dispose of the produced water?
That's in our script here. We're going to get to it.
You're going to get to it.
Yes, I promise you.
Oh, well, good. Then I'll ask the question after you've gotten to it.
Okay, that's
Thank
fine. I have one more question, though, because we're in the Northern Colorado Water Conservancy District, and I understand that they have boundaries, that you're not allowed to take water from here outside of their district. How is that regulated? Who does that?
Do you want to talk to that? So this is a relatively new issue that's coming up, and I'm not a water law expert, of which we may have one at this table. So I'll simply say that this is an opportunity for industry to dialogue with the districts, and it's ongoing right now. So we're trying to understand what their priorities and objectives are, and this is a new process. It's new to the industry, and we're working through it with the district. You want to add
Phil,
anything?
do you know about that?
Yeah, they're trying to limit, and they probably should, any sales of water to area inside the district. But beyond that, there's the rather ugly and embarrassing problem that the Northern District wants new storage and new diversions from the West Slope. And it seems rather odd to me that we should be asking for that when we've already almost destroyed the Colorado River for fracking. But those two go together, and I don't think you can separate them. I think it's hand in glove, and the demand for new water must have some bearing on the demand for water for fracking. I don't think you can separate the two and think of them as separate issues. I think they're inextricably combined.
So are you saying that if they want to build the reservoir north of Fort Collins, that a lot of that water would go for fracking?
I think it's an inevitable conclusion. I don't think you could conclude anything else.
Okay.
I think it's quite easy to conclude something else because I do. So I'll just say that I think fracking is an important part of the conversation as much as anything that's 1/10 of 1% of the water use, and that it is important that we have these discussions. But linking it as if it were 90 or 100%, I think misplaces the role of other stakeholders who are important to have at the table.
Okay, Mike?
I think the statistic, if I got it right, the initial expert analysis we did at Western Resource Advocates, that Weld County, which has about 15,000 wells, I think the percentage comparison was that the water being used for oil and gas there could be as much as 30 to 60% as the municipal and industrial use in Weld County. And we're still in the process of nailing that down, but if you do get a big Niobrara boom going here in Larimer and adjacent counties in this section of the state, you could be looking at some really significant numbers, and that's a long way off. That's several years off, a decade or two off, but it's something we need to be cognizant of.
Okay, and can Colorado Big Thompson water be used for that, or does it have to be for municipal and agricultural use?
All the water has to be obtained through legal means and used for legal purposes, so depending on what the water rights are, I imagine the potential is there, but I'm not familiar with the specifics.
Okay, do you know that?
I don't. I think it's an interesting question, though, and as I said before, I think there's a real issue about changing this water use, which carries with it a consumptive use equation, to extinction for oil and gas. Now, you could get away with that if you bring it from the west side, because that water has already been depleted under our water supply calculations for the Colorado River. But is that really what we want to do? We haven't had that conversation. I think we need to have it.
And just to add some color to that conversation, not all water that is being talked about, there's two types of water, non-tributary and tributary. So some water is not coming from what we think of in terms of the shallow groundwater that's interfacing with the surface water. So there's also non-tributary water, and both of these water uses are treated quite differently throughout Colorado in terms of how we're addressing their use and their reuse.
Okay, Mike?
And there's another issue we need to be looking at. further into the future, but my understanding is that some of the wells, they've come up with processes to treat the produced water and get it back into the system. Okay, and one of the public policy concerns, so we could actually have more water, we'd be depleting finite groundwater reservoirs, but as we're dewatering those formations, in the process of developing and drilling and producing oil and gas, if you can affordably treat the water and resell it, that's temporarily until it's exhausted, more water on the system. One of the things you want to guard against is too much residential development and population growth that becomes dependent on that short-term supply.
Okay. Now, to get to domestic wells and nearby aquifers, are they tested before drilling begins?
They are. Are we going to get to the gentleman's question about what goes wrong? Because I could address that in the same context.
Sure, I'm there now.
I think it's an important question. I wanted to make sure we got to it.
Oh, yes.
So it's an important question about what's happening below ground surface. And the most important venue for ensuring that operations happen safely is to ensure that that cement is put in place. And in 2008, when Colorado overhauled its oil and gas rules, it put rules in place specifically to make sure that cementing and casing was done properly. And that was based on failures that had happened in Colorado historically, some of which were covered in the movie Gasland. So this is very important for you to know for your own sense of comfort about what's happening in new operations. So when cement is placed, all operators now have to do a cement bond log under regulation, which ensures that that cement is placed correctly. In addition, before hydraulic fracturing, the operator has to hold the well at pressure higher than will happen in hydraulic fracturing operations. So they have to demonstrate that the well can handle the operation that's about to happen. And then third, and probably most importantly, they have to do what's called Braden head monitoring, which is a way of saying at the surface, monitoring the pressure in the well to make sure that as those operations are happening, nothing is failing. The well's not failing, the ground surface isn't failing. So if anything like that happened, it would be known immediately. People are literally watching this minute by minute in the trailer where the operation's occurring, and they would have to shut in the well and report it immediately. So there are things that have come into place in regulatory requirements to address things that did go wrong in history, and I think that's an important point that you made. And in all of that, I forgot what the question was I was trying to answer.
Well, he was talking about what they call the flaming faucet in Gasland, and I'm wondering how that occurred.
Right, okay, so the flaming faucet in Gasland, I encourage you to go to either COGA's website or the COGCC's website, both of which addressed all the Colorado incidents from Gasland in much detail, which we don't have time to go into tonight. But the flaming faucet in Gasland is a long-known story in Colorado where we have shallow coal seams in Colorado. And if you dewater coal, then methane is produced, and that's why we have coal bed methane. So in places of Colorado, including the Raton Basin near Trinidad and San Juan Basin and parts of northeast Colorado, for hundreds of years, you could light your water on fire because you're essentially dewatering. And so you're either dewatering coal or you're dewatering, you're allowing an oil and gas formation to come to the surface that's quite shallow. So the flaming faucet in Gasland is one that has been definitively demonstrated to be naturally occurring methane, not associated with drilling. It's unfortunate that it was featured in Gasland because it has really frightened a lot of people. And in fact, we know that there are many wells that have methane problems. And in fact, if you're worried about this for where you live, we have on our website a link to a state document called How Well Do You Know Your Water Well, which helps you address what issues you might have in your well and how you can remediate those.
Okay, Mike?
In terms of Gasland, the director was doing his best to report on the experience of the citizens living in the gas patch. And I've read very carefully the COGCC fact sheet on Gasland. And my understanding, I forget it was 4 instances or 6 individual case studies, 2 or 3 on the Front Range and 2 or 3 on the West Slope. And what I concluded is that COGCC is saying that fracking, narrowly and strictly defined, did not directly cause what was depicted in the movie. There's a distinction between biogenic methane and thermogenic methane. So setting the taps on fire may not have directly resulted from the fracking operations. But COGCC did conclude and does acknowledge that there were some pretty bad instances of water contamination for real people in our state that were related to the drilling processes largely likely to find whatever the source of the contamination, leaking surface pit or something else that went wrong, because it doesn't always go according to plan in any realm of human endeavor. Things go wrong, the log is not kept, the violation or the problem is not called in right away, somebody fell asleep in the tractor, the equipment wasn't working, the company doesn't want to face the liability. But anyway, read the COGCC fact sheet, read it closely, and you'll find out that oil and gas operations did cause some pretty bad problems for some of these citizens that were looked at there. In some cases, the company in the drilling operation was exonerated.
Okay, Phil?
Well, there is one case that I think everybody should probably take a look at, and that's down by Levita, and it was coal bed methane again, shallow, but it did leak into a number of homes. The homes had to be evacuated. Their value on the open market is probably nil. The oil company, Petroclip, walked away. They didn't clean up the groundwater contamination. And the state didn't require them to do it. There's a huge problem up in Wyoming at Pavilion where people have told me it's probably a Superfund site. Just let me give you some idea how expensive it is to clean up groundwater. You're all familiar with the Rocky Mountain Arsenal. The public spent $2 billion now, not million, $2 billion cleaning up the surface there. They are still cleaning up the groundwater, the shallow groundwater. They are spending $10 million a year into infinity to control that groundwater contamination from reaching the Platte River and the homes underneath that plume. So this is not small business we're talking about here. If there's an accident, it is a huge cost to the public, not only in terms of health, but to the environment. And we should be aware of these things.
And I would just respectfully disagree that a comparison from the Arsenal cleanup to an oil and gas site is of the scale and magnitude that's appropriate. But I will say that there's quite a bit of disagreement about these sites, and all of this information is publicly available. So to the extent that you're curious, the COGCC investigations are public on their website. They report monthly in their hearings. And so this is something that if you're interested, you can look into in more detail, and that way we don't have to rebut everything here.
Okay, did we answer your question?
I may have my details slightly wrong on this, so I'm sure the panel can help me. It's my understanding that former Vice President Dick Cheney put in place a provision somewhere in legislation that was passed during his time in office that would exempt the oil and gas industry from the Clean Water Act and the Clean Air Act with respect to the fracking operations that we're talking about. I wish somebody would comment on that, because it seems quite appropriate to talk about what goes wrong. We've heard about the things that go right and great plans to keep water clean, but I'm just not seeing any emphasis on what happens when something goes wrong. And in fact, a lot of it's predictable. When you take water and you add to it hundreds of different chemicals to make the fracking work better, and then basically what I'm hearing is it's pumped back into the ground in another location, and some of it stays down there. Well, is there in place a real enforcement of where the water is disposed of? That's the produced water that has these fracking chemicals in it? And is there any public right to know? Is there a public right to know presently?
Yeah, we'll get to that too. Let's answer the first question about the Clean Water Act.
Let me try and field that. You're referring to the 2005 Energy Policy Act passed by Congress, signed into law by former President Bush, and it had a limited exemption under the Safe Drinking Water Act for oil and gas operations. And if I'm correct, use of diesel was still subject to federal regulatory jurisdiction under the Safe Drinking Water Act, not the Clean Water Act. But, Cheney was vice president at the time. We know he came from Halliburton between his term in Congress. What was of much greater concern for me was that EPA began to launch phase 1 of a study of hydraulic fracturing. And I think we've got agreement on the table. I hope we have agreement society-wide. We need good science. This is a new technology. What are the risks? And EPA started down the road of addressing the risks. The movie Gasland hadn't been aired yet, but there was anecdotal accounts from citizens in the gas patch across the country that I had clean water, the well went in, and I've got problems. It smells bad, health problems, people getting sick, and it was anecdotal evidence. And state oil and gas regulatory commissions tended to be aligned or perceived to be aligned with industry in the past. Everybody was saying, don't worry, there's no issue. You tend to think where there's smoke, there's fire. EPA walked away from an in-depth, peer-reviewed study in 2003 for what appeared to be political reasons. They wanted to encourage the growth of the fossil fuel industry and the boom of oil and gas and natural gas, modern hydraulic fracturing. Today, EPA is recommencing that study that got not just sidetracked, but it hit a brick wall under the Bush administration. And the phase 1 results are going to be available, the first year results, I think in 2013. There's going to be later results in 2015 and 2016. What I'm driving at is I have a very strong belief we need to carefully regulate hydraulic fracturing. Colorado has made some good advances. There's more work to be done in Colorado, but we need to look at it from a federal level so that we have a base of adequate regulations that apply nationwide, but we really don't know enough about the risks and the science, the potential, and the proof and evidence of contamination yet. We don't have enough facts to inform what kind of a regulatory structure is going to be comprehensive and really do what needs to be done to protect our water. And a lot of that goes to politics, as you asked. But I think it was the EPA study being derailed was much more significant. The ability to regulate requires informed regulation, which requires good peer-reviewed science. And that's what we're waiting for because we didn't do it when we should have.
Phil, do you have a comment?
Okay. Go ahead, I was just going to take part 2 of the question.
Yeah, what happened in the Energy Act of 2005 was what is called the Halliburton loophole. And at the wellhead, at the well site, the industry is pretty much exempt from the Clean Water Act, Safe Drinking Water Act, Clean Air Act, and CERCLA. So they have a broad exemption that nobody else in the country has. So it is a problem. I mean, it is a real problem, and it's the reason we don't have good science on this is because we're not doing the measuring, because it doesn't have to be done. There was an incident, I think, reported. You can find it on YouTube. It's Erie Rising, right down the road here. NOAA came in there with an air monitoring program, and the air quality in Erie, you know where it is about the same as it is in Houston and Los Angeles. And almost all of that is attributable, they think, to the oil and gas industry. Now, that should give us all pause. What are we doing to ourselves and what are we doing to our children because we don't have any information? The lack of information does not mean it's safe. It just means there's a lack of information.
Okay,
So
go
just a
ahead,
quick
Tisha.
comment, because I think we've all agreed that we rely on good science, and peer-reviewed science is important, and the data just referenced in Erie was just presented in a public meeting and is both not available for industry review and it hasn't been peer-reviewed and was given with many, many caveats. So I hope that we will all agree that that borders on anecdotal, which is then difficult for us to make sound policy decisions. And I want to make sure that our citizens are informed about what's out there, but also about what the real science is. So I wanted to get to part 2. With regards to the exemption to the Safe Drinking Water Act, it's actually discussing a very specific type of need for a permit, and that's an underground injection control permit. But that doesn't mean that that activity is unregulated. It's actually regulated by the state of Colorado. So all of the fracking operations are regulated by the state of Colorado. So just because you hear, and you will hear many times, that there is exemptions to this and this and this and this, in fact, every aspect is regulated. For example, you'll hear the industry isn't regulated under the Clean Air Act. But in fact, EPA delegates its authority to the state, to the CDPHE, and oil and gas operations run under extremely stringent air quality program. So I just want to clarify that. With regards to permanent disposal wells, this is a long topic, perhaps not appropriate for tonight, so I'll give a brief description, but don't give a brief description? Okay, so I won't give a brief description, but I am happy to answer your question later. Okay.
Real quickly, there was an exemption to the Clean Water Act also, having to do with stormwater runoff at oil and gas development sites, I think. And to Colorado's credit, Colorado got together after the federal exemption was granted under the 2005 EPACT, and Colorado regulated under its independent authority regulations passed and approved by the Colorado Water Quality Control Commission, if I'm correct. So Colorado, we all agree we don't want runoff and sediment, except Congress didn't agree, and it's one of the things that snuck through in a really fat act that never should have, and it was a favor to the industry.
Okay, another question?
Yes, my name is Barbara Mills-Bria, and I'm a structural engineer. And when we do a design for reinforced concrete, we produce a specifications package, drawings, and spec paragraphs. And then we have companies bid on that, and they build it. But to make sure that they build it correctly, we have inspectors on site all the time. So I guess my question, I think it's for Tisha, is how many inspectors are there in the state of Colorado? So how many wells is each inspector required to watch?
So the first part of your question with regards to cement quality, and the industry actually has to submit their cement specs, and then they have to test those specs. So there's laboratories set up in different areas that do exactly what you're saying, and those things are submitted as part of the application and follow through. With regards to how many inspectors there are, that's a question best directed to COGCC, but I'll do my best. I think they have 17 inspectors, and last year they went to 17,000 wells, so they basically go to approximately 1/3 of the wells each year for inspections.
I have my own statistics on that, and that was that we have 15 for the whole state and 2 in our area. And that's from a page 26 of the Stronger report, which came out, I think, in this August? Okay. I don't know if you have any more information.
Quick anecdote, quick fact. My brother's a structural engineer and architect. Buildings are built according to code. They're inspected. He wouldn't have a job if the buildings always did what they were supposed to. They never leaked. They never had structural issues. No industry is different on that front. Sidewalk cracks in your sidewalk in my driveway. In terms of the cement, I was talking to a really informed industry official today. I think he was with Anadarko. He was explaining the Stronger Commission recommended certain concrete casing requirements. What he was explaining to me, and I'd heard that you want it to be an adequate depth, and except when you don't. And he was saying if you put the concrete, whatever it's called, casing too deep, and it hits a formation that's all kind of clay and wet, that could crash the whole thing, and it could undermine the entire integrity. So a one size, you're going thousands of feet underground. You don't always know what you're dealing with, and even with the best of intentions, the best regs, the best oversight, you're never 100% sure what's going to happen.
Okay, let's go on with my agenda, and then we'll ask some more questions. One of the things that I want to know is where the effluent goes. Is it trucked away, and then where does it go? And what about the ponds? Are there open ponds somewhere?
So you're looking at me, so I'll take the question.
Yes, I think you know.
Yeah, so there's 3 different ways that water is disposed of in the state, and there's 2 different types of water. There's flowback water, so water that's used in the production cycle, and then there's associated water, produced water, that's part of the oil and gas formation that comes to surface that Mike alluded to earlier. So this is a new source of water. So essentially water can either be permanently disposed of in an underground injection control well. That's the well that's a permanent disposal. They exist in all industries. About half of those wells in Colorado are associated with the oil and gas industry.
And how deep are they?
They vary, but they're in historically not potable aquifers or old oil and gas formations, so they're very deep, maybe in this area 7,000 feet below ground surface, 8 to 10,000 feet. And then there is recycling, of course, and reusing at the surface. And then there is, you alluded to this earlier, there's surface release. So in the Raton Basin, for example, the produced water from shallow coal bed methane is so clean that it meets the discharge standards, and it's actually released into the into the hydrogeologic cycle.
And what is a closed loop system?
Oh yeah, and a closed loop, okay, so there's two different kinds of water management system. One is essentially all tanks on site, and one is where you use pits to store water as you're working through your process. In Colorado, I don't have all the data with me, but I can get these for folks that are interested. The industry has been continuously increasing the use of closed loop systems, so I think we're up to over 82% of all drilling in the state is now in closed loop system.
Okay, Mike?
Yeah, and what I've seen is that, and I think it's the DJ Basin, Denver, Julesburg, and the Piceance, two of the leading drilling basins and producing basins in the state. I've heard closed loop is greater than 90%. And a real quick history lesson that's real relevant. 3 or 4 or 5 years ago, Colorado had outdated oil and gas regulatory framework and an industry-dominated commission. To industry's great credit, they said, we want to be good corporate actors. We're going to support or not oppose reform legislation. 2 bills were passed in 2007. We had a comprehensive statewide rulemaking, which was quite a food fight. But at the end of the day, we have the most comprehensive, updated set of oil and gas regulations in the nation. And the reason that industry is doing more closed loop, or part of the reason is we had a tough pit rule that encouraged industry to innovate and to come up with something that appears to be a win-win for everybody that's now being employed 90% of the time. Nobody wants to live near a pit. And thanks to innovations, 90% pitless drilling, that's a real benefit from where we were a few years ago. And, as kind of moderate mainstream, we're trying to work together and to keep improving Colorado's regulatory framework. If we can say there's a problem and there's going to be environmental benefits that are cost effective to address it, we like to work collaboratively for solutions.
Okay, Phil, any comment?
No, I mean, we think that it should all be closed loop. It's voluntary now. I think most in the industry, the bigger people, do closed loop. I think some of the smaller guys can't afford to, apparently, from what I've heard. But we definitely think it should all be closed loop.
Okay, and then I have another question, because those of us who read the news saw that Ohio had some earthquakes, and they said it was from storing the effluent, I think, underground. So how do we know we're not going to have that?
So we're going to get to this disposal well question after all. So underground injection control wells are permanent disposal wells. They're used across the country. There's 500,000 across the country, used in every industry: mining, energy production, manufacturing, wastewater, final disposal, things like that. So there's 500,000 of them. We know that in a disposal well, if you're injecting fluids for long periods of time, which is the purpose of a disposal well, that if you had an existing fault below ground surface, that you could build up pressure in that fault, and it could cause movement, which could cause an earthquake. It happened here at Rocky Mountain Arsenal in the 70s. So we know that that's possible. Of 500,000 of these wells across the country in the last few years, 2 have been associated with earthquakes in Arkansas and Ohio. And there's some dispute about what's the cause of these. But even if we assume that they are caused by the disposal well, then we know that there is the potential, but we also know that it's quite small. So what is relevant to a disposal well is where is it relative to known seismic activity. When you shut in these wells, including what happened here at the Arsenal, the earthquakes stop. So disposal wells are something that have the potential for earthquake, but that is quite small. In Colorado, Phil alluded to the numbers. We have about 600 underground injection controlled disposal wells, and about half of them are associated with the oil and gas industry.
Okay. Yes, Phil?
I happen to be working with some people in Commerce City because they're concerned about that old seismic activity there and the prospect of some new wells being dug around Commerce City and in the city itself. And one of the things that came out in conversations with the Corps of Engineers is that when they put that water or that hazardous material underground back in the 60s, they only did it for 4 years. And what they put underground, as I recall my calculation, was about equal to what the volume of water that you would use for 33 horizontally wells at 5 million gallons per well. And they put that water underground at a pressure of 1,100 psi, which is a fraction of what they would be using on fracking for oil and gas in most cases. I've seen figures up to 15,000 psi. So there is an issue there. My friend Wes Wilson, who's a geologist, doesn't think the risk is very great. But I'm not into that kind of thing. I think when people's property and well-being are threatened, I think we deserve to take a look at it and see if there is any chance of correlation. Because certainly you had that activity out there in the 60s, and certainly if they frack there, they're going to be using more water or more liquid dumped underground. Now, it doesn't go into the same area. That's true. But it's worth an examination.
I think that's a great point, and unfortunately, it has been examined. So there's a professor at Stanford University, Mark Zobak, and he studies extensively the microseismic activity associated with hydraulic fracturing. There are many researchers that do. He just happened to come out and give a talk out here, so I'm familiar with his work. But on the Richter scale, hydraulic fracturing does create tiny microseismic events. So Phil is right. It's the equivalent of if you held a milk jug on the counter and you dropped it. So which might be equivalent to slamming a door or a truck driving by. So there is seismic activity, but it's so small on the Richter scale as to be really irrelevant in the context of what would happen at surface and what would cause a movement that we could feel.
But what it points out is that you're injecting millions of gallons of fluids, water and other fluids underground at really high pressures, and whether or not you can fill a trembler at the surface, where we started off was several thousand feet, maybe in some formations, not here but elsewhere, a couple hundred feet or only a few thousand feet of rock or shale between the oil and gas producing formation and the groundwater reservoirs. You're going to have, if there are existing fissures in the rock, you have had documented earthquakes and seismic activities on at least one site in North America, one site in Europe. There's suspicion in the Raton Basin, northern New Mexico, southern Colorado. So it's just common sense that if you've got existing fissures and the rock is not 100% impermeable, there's cracks and fissures, it's what's a geohydrological, I'm getting it wrong, hydrogeological connectivity, I believe is the scientific term for what you're concerned with, the potential for connection between the oil and gas formation and the fracking fluids in the groundwater reservoir, and all the science isn't in, and it's something that we should be concerned about. We shouldn't just dismiss it out of hand.
Okay. Now, a question back on the inspections. Are 2 people in northern Colorado enough?
Well, from the noises I heard from the audience, I think most people here would say no. This really isn't an appropriate question for industry because the COGCC regulates industry, but I will say that what is important is that Colorado has the most stringent regulations in the country. Inspections are done on a surprise basis at 17,000 wells a year, and industry is willing and interested in more oversight. So we supported additional FTE at the state level this year for them to bring on additional staff to increase their staff. So it's not something that we object to, and we're supportive of more on-site oversight.
So they can begin to use the well before it's been inspected. Is that correct or not?
So the inspections are more about ongoing maintenance and compliance. You have to submit your data to the COGCC. So there's not just 17 or 15, you said the number of people in the state. There's 72 overseeing oil and gas activity. So there's a lot going on in the permit application and review process that's about what's happening at the site. For example, I told you there's cement bond logs. Someone on site wouldn't see anything happening. It's a matter of inspecting the data that is relevant to what's happening on site.
Okay, Mike?
And I'd like to address inspection and oversight by raising the local control issue, which has had a lot of attention at the local level and the State House this year. And interestingly enough, the party that usually favors local control is against it for local oil and gas control. But what I want to say is that a potential solution, Gunnison County has negotiated a memorandum of understanding with the COGCC that allows a Gunnison County consultant to assist the state in inspection. And that's probably going to be some money out of pocket for the county, but it might be a way to increase the capacity if there's a local perception that the wells aren't being inspected frequently or rigorously enough.
Okay, and who pays for the inspection? Go ahead.
Well, the public does ultimately. We do get some money from the severance tax, which is the way we fund the COGCC. But Mike brought up a subject. I happened to testify on 2 bills last couple of weeks on local control or home rule. And because the COGCC has its set rules, anything beyond that is subject to challenge or preemption, as they use the term in law. And one way you could get a better understanding of what's going on out there is to allow the cities and towns who have staff and who have professional engineers to do some of this work. But the COGCC will not allow that. And the oil and gas industry has absolutely condemned this alternative. This wouldn't be no cost to the taxpayers because those people already exist, but they do not want the cities and the home rule cities, Fort Collins being one, to have any say in what goes on in the oil and gas industry and how it conducts its business in our backyard.
So that's just blatantly incorrect, but I don't know if you want to have a discussion of local government. In fact, the industry supports the Gunnison County MOU and IGA process, and we're very interested in engaging. And if we want to have a local government debate, I'm happy to go into the options for local governments to engage, but maybe you have more water questions.
Yeah, I think we'll try to get to some of the audience questions. I just wanted to cover what we thought we were going to cover. Go ahead.
I can tell you that on House Bill 1277, the oil and gas industry en masse opposed it, and all it asked for was for more local control on oil and gas issues, and it was introduced by Matt Jones, and I testified for it, as did about 28 other people, but it was defeated.
Yeah, John Gascoigne here, been a Larimer County resident for about 50 years. This is maybe a question of context, but I've heard a couple of references to Weld County and no references to Larimer County. My information is that exploration, there are exploration permits being issued in Larimer County at the present time at an increasing rate. If anyone on the panel can speak to this, I'd like to know if that's correct, and if so, what that portends for Larimer County.
Sure. So we've referenced Weld County because Weld County is what's in the proven part of the Niobrara. So it's an area where we know that there is current and forecasted operations. Larimer falls into the same category as much of the Front Range, which is in the exploratory phase. So essentially, companies know that the geologic formation is beneath the site, but they don't know if it has natural gas liquids, oils, natural gas at an economic quantity, if it's going to be recoverable. So essentially, this is an unfolding chapter. No one knows what the result will be. There have been many dry holes so far, so there are areas that are not going to be further explored. And so this is something we'll know as the exploration activity unfolds, probably over the next 2 years.
Dennis Murphy, Fort Collins. I think it's important to recognize that the integrity of the casing is relevant only as to how far the casing extends into the shale itself. But once the water is injected into the shale, obviously it's going into the ground, the earth. And so I just want to mention that we were talking about anecdotal evidence for migration of the hydrofracking fluids into groundwater. There was a study by a Cornell geology professor that came out this past summer that did indicate that there was a non-theoretical and very definite risk of migration of hydrofracking fluids into the groundwater. And Mr. Sharopoulos, you might be familiar with this study. If not, I'd be happy to send you a copy of it. But that is a non-anecdotal evidence of this non-theoretical fracking possibility.
Yeah, so I think you're referring to the Duke methane and groundwater study. Not that Cornell is an air study, but they came out about the same time. So yes, there's a Duke study that looked at historic oil and gas operations, and then methane in shallow groundwater. Like Colorado, Pennsylvania has over 100-year history of oil and gas development. So there are, like Colorado, areas with known methane in shallow aquifers. So there are quite a few studies actually furthering the work of that study, and it isn't quite a bit of dispute, but it's quite an interesting area of if you have oil and gas operations, do you have methane in groundwater? The conclusions are inconclusive. What we do know in Colorado is we have 10 years of shallow groundwater data in the San Juan Basin, over 7,000 data points, where we've had oil and gas operations at the shallowest they are in the state. And this data set indicates that oil and gas operations can happen in harmony with safe drinking water. That data is publicly available, and you can find it on the COGCC website.
Say that slower so people can hear it.
COGCC website.
Hi, Cindy Anderson. Being an engineer, I know crud happens. I'm working on developing legislation that would have like a fee per drill or a fee per frac to set up a fund to pay for. How would industry and how would they feel about that?
So that fund, there is a $2 million emergency response fund in the state. It hasn't been tapped at all in the last several years, but it exists for the purpose of remediating abandoned sites or historic sites. So we do know with 100 years of history, in some neighborhood they're going to drill someday and find an old well, and that fund is set up to ensure that, and it's funded from severance tax.
My name's Jim Smith, and I live in Fort Collins. I wonder if anybody on the board has ever read a book called Collapse by Jared Diamond. Has anybody read that book? I put it on your list.
I know.
I wonder about the culpability of these companies. When somebody mentioned Pennsylvania, I'm a kayaker from Pennsylvania, and almost every river and stream in that state is screwed up, and from mining and gas and oil exploration. I live up in northwestern Pennsylvania, and French Creek is one of the most pristine places because none of that happened up there. There wasn't anything they wanted up there. So, but I'd like to know more. We talked about inspectors. I'd like to know more about the culpability, because Diamond talks about all this carnage that happened and these companies walked away and the taxpayers paid for it. Bitterroot Valley was one of them.
Okay?
I'd like to turn it around and say we live in a democracy. Look in the mirror, right? Who's using the energy? Who's authorizing these companies to do what they're doing? They're making their money by supplying a legal product that we're consuming. So you're going to blame the addict for what's happening with the drug production and the drug trafficking, or are you going to blame, the traffickers and the producers? So, I mean, you hear what I'm trying to say, and it might not be Diamond, but I thought it might have been a similar book says that that's why we're responsible as a society to raise the bar as we're trying to do in Colorado, so that every single company, and not just the bigger ones that have a greater commitment, which is a significant proportion in Colorado. One of the things we're seeing is modern shale gas is expensive and it's complicated. The little guys, the mom and pops, you're trying to put a kid through college by drilling a couple wells a year, those guys can't compete anymore because it takes more money and more resources to comply with the kind of regulatory framework that we need based on the kind of drilling that we've got today. So that might not directly answer your question, but I don't want to just blame the companies. I would say, what's really going on here? We're all using the product, right?
I can address.
Wait a minute, he doesn't have, we need the microphone.
I can address the question. So the question was, when something goes wrong, who's responsible? So under Colorado state law, anytime there's any complaint, not just a proven incident, but it has to be investigated by the state, all those investigations are open to the public, and they have to be addressed to full remediation standards, to full state standards. So there is not a scenario in the state of Colorado where an incident can happen and it isn't addressed. All incidents have to be completely remediated, and companies are responsible, and all of the fines, history, investigations are all publicly available.
But Colorado does not yet have a mandatory statewide rule requiring baseline testing before drilling, rigorous ongoing monitoring, and use of tracers. And we've got a few technical hurdles to work through, but until we have that statewide rule, we're going to be having he said, she said, like we have in Pavilion in Gasland when there's an incidence of alleged contamination. An industry has a due process right to have it stay in court and say, listen, don't blame me, it wasn't my actions. So you need to bring good science to bear, and we're hoping to sit down with reasonable industry partners and say a statewide rule is in industry's best interest as well as the citizens.
All right, I'm Ann Haroon from Loveland, and I'm very concerned about aquifers. When we lived in, if you could go back to that first slide, I don't know whether you've got time to do that or not, but it shows various layers of very shallow aquifer and then a lot of underlayment. And those are not always, those were from Pennsylvania. They're not always the proportions that we see. When I lived in Albuquerque, we were told that the aquifer under Albuquerque was a mile deep. It's a half-mile deep because they've used it up now. So it goes down faster than they thought. But anyway, my concern with aquifers was both the possibility for contamination of the actual aquifer when things go wrong, and the potential in earthquakes and so forth that also when things go wrong, that the aquifer could actually drain. And that's it.
So the slides that we showed at the beginning of the program were the actual Colorado scenario, and every basin in Colorado is different. And I did mention there are a couple basins where operations and coal bed methane happen as shallow as 1,500 feet. But the Niobrara that we're talking about today is separated by 4,000 feet of impermeable, well-documented Pierre shale. So hopefully that will bring some comfort to that discussion. And then with regards to baseline water sampling is extraordinarily important. And COGA has put together a voluntary water sampling program. It's 93% subscribed, meaning operators that drill 93% of all wells are participating. The program went into effect in January. It means samples are taken before drilling and after drilling. And while Colorado now has the best water data set in the country, the 7,000 samples I referred to earlier, in the first year we'll collect more than double that quantity of samples. So we will have statewide water quality data this year. It's in progress and it'll all be available. It will all be publicly available.
So New York City's water is not treated. I don't know if everybody knows that, but the watershed is the Catskills. It's piped directly to the city, untreated because the Catskills are preserved. Last I heard, and it's been a moving target, New York is going to allow drilling and fracking outside a couple of select aquifers. And I might not have all my facts straight, but generally speaking, that's the last I've heard. Here in Colorado, is it the South Platte, Phil, where we're seeing some interest in leasing and potential drilling? I don't know if it's Niobrara, but the headwaters of the South Platte, which supplies Denver's water. And no one wants a groundwater aquifer or a surface stream to be contaminated, but we need to work together the best we can to guard against it and make some hard decisions about whether certain headwaters areas may be appropriate for drilling or not.
Yeah, let me answer that. Respond to that. About 80,000 acres have been leased up in the South Platte Basin. It's our headwaters. It's where Denver gets its water supply. You might ask why anybody would lease land for oil and gas exploration where we get our water supply. Interesting question. And I guess it points back to the problem we have in this state. We have done no planning. We are simply letting the oil and gas industry determine our future. And to the man's question about accountability, what happens is if the COGCC determines that the oil and gas industry is responsible, they will tell the person that's been damaged that, yes, the oil and gas industry caused the damage to your groundwater. But at that point, the state backs away. It does not represent the citizen. The citizen has to represent himself against the oil and gas industry. That is true. That is absolutely correct. And you never know what the settlement is because it's not a public document. So the oil and gas industry makes a settlement with that individual, and that's the end of the story. So our database never gets any broader because we don't know what went on, because it's not a public record. We need to have this record in order to be able to, act like rational people.
Okay, one 30-second answer if you want to answer that.
Sure. I will just say that the COGCC has to follow these incidents to their conclusion. If a private party wants to negotiate for damages with a company, they are welcome to do that, and that's a private legal matter between two adult parties. So these is two different issues that we're talking about. One is ensuring that the state addresses the issue to completion. The other is if a party wants to negotiate with a company for some kind of settlement, they are free to do so, and they may keep that private if they wish.
Okay, I think we're out of time. This CrossCurrents program will be rebroadcast at various times during the month on Channel 14. In Fort Collins, please consult your local listings for exact times and places, or dates. Copies of recent CrossCurrents programs are available for checkout at the Poudre River Library at 201 Peterson Street and the branch at Front Range Community College at Shield Street and Harmony Road. The video is available at the League of Women Voters website, which is www.lwv-larimercounty.org. Thank you to our panelists, to our studio audiences, and to our viewing audience. And I want to tell you that next month we hope to discuss the proposal to build a football stadium on the CSU campus. So if you'd like to come again, we'd like to see you. Thanks a lot.